Good morning, gentlemen. Thank you for the coffee. Without it, I don't think I could get through this post-clocks change morning. This will be the last year on Rav Kook, and I apologise for the sort of interruptions. But I do want to move on to other topics, other great thinkers, and I am open for nominations if anyone has any suggestions for other great thinkers that we could look at next. I want to really dedicate this year to an exploration of, depending on how much time we have, 3, 4, 5 letters of Rav Kook, which I think are letters and speeches of Rav Kook, which I think are quite revealing of one more aspect of his thinking, which I want to look at. And with that, as I said, we'll conclude. And I want to introduce a sort of 19th century philosophical term called a dialectic reasoning. Now, the idea of proof by contradiction dates back to the ancient world. If I present an idea and you can demonstrate how, by fleshing this idea out, it ends up contradicting itself, then you have a disproof of this idea. If I present an idea and you can find an outright contradiction to it, then again, you have disproof of the idea. And we're familiar with this sort of reasoning from every page of Gemara. In the West, it's often called Socratic reasoning. It dates back to Socrates, who used this, perhaps hones this form of reasoning to a fine razor blade to cut through ideas. But in the 19th century, it sort of became almost the idea of, they used to call it thesis and antithesis and synthesis. The idea that if you could find an idea and then its contradiction, out of that could almost be born a deeper truth, which was the synthesis between these two ideas. And sometimes this was also read into history. So history goes in waves, where perhaps there's an idea and a way of thinking, which then experiences a backlash, which perhaps goes too far the other way, and out of that hopefully emerges a synthesis which is truer than either of the two extremes. Again, these aren't new ideas, and Rav Kook in fact will demonstrate that some of this way of thinking, he'll argue, is quite Kabbalistic, but this is a very much brought to the fore at least in the broader world in philosophy in 19th century Germany. Hegel, Marx, we'll take them as separate things, but Hegel sort of speaks about this a lot. Marx reads this into the history of capitalism, and then workers' rights, you have this sort of backlash and so on. And the idea has an intuition to it. I mean, maybe just to look at where you could apply it to recent history, maybe we could look at the 20th century and say that the first part of the 20th century, both parts of the century in different ways, had philosophies which felt they could make sweeping truths about the human condition. And both of these philosophies led to enormous damage. So you have fascism and communism, in which they want to neatly categorize people, in the name of truth, with a capital T. We have insights, almost fundamentalist belief in truth, and anyone who doesn't fit with these insights, we can sort of lop off and cut out in order to fit into our boxes. There's been a reaction to that, perhaps from the 60s and in origin, but in the public domain, perhaps from the 90s and on, in which there's extreme suspicion of truth, an extreme suspicion of any structure to society. So let's throw everything out, any belief about nationality or family life or anything else like that. So it's also swung the opposite way for lots of understandable reasons. And any attempt to present a morality other than perhaps the very, very basic morality of don't bother others, we're very, very suspicious of, because we've seen where overconfident expressions of belief can lead to. And perhaps now we're in the opposite extreme. And then the hope is that out of that you arrive at a balance in which there's a sort of a middle road. In some ways, it's a bit like the golden mean. which the Rambam expresses as if someone sees they've got very miserly tendencies, then push yourself to over generosity, and that will get you back to the middle. If you're overly arrogant, then go to over modesty, and then that will get you back to the middle. But this is the sort of realm of dialectic, this idea of thesis and antithesis and synthesis that's born from the two. It's an idea of two competing ideas that are in tension, and rather than seeing contradiction as being a problem in your thinking, you almost see it as a strength. Because if you have these two things which are so clearly important and profound, and they're in tension, then as they are in conflict with each other and in friction with each other, out of that will emerge energy and light and heat and good things. So and I want to emphasize again, in some sense, the origins of these ideas, and Rav Kook spells this out when he speaks about his philosophy or dialectical philosophy. The origin of these ideas is really in Kabbala's exploration of how can the finite and the infinite relate to each other. So we have a problem. We have an infinite perfect world, an infinite perfect creator. We have a finite imperfect world, and the two somehow coexist, and out of that needs to emerge a synthesis. Out of that needs to emerge some way in which the two can complement each other. So he grounds this in Kabbala ideas. I've mentioned Rav Kook's thinking of the relationship between finite and infinite when we looked at evolution, in which he said what a wonderful idea it is that the infinite created a finite world that has infinite potential, that out of it can emerge so much of a flourishing of life and so on. But Rav Kook sees this as he sees this as the impetus for divine creativity, that and he sees this as part of his view of a world which is in motion and fluid and it's ever moving towards perfection. So he grounds these ideas in origin in the very sort of heart of the mystery of our creation, that the unchanging perfection of the Ein Sof. Ein Sof is the Kabbalistic Hebrew word for the infinite, for Ein Sof, for the one without end. That the unchanging perfection of the Ein Sof creates a world which is constantly striving and moving and yearning to perfect itself, and yet is imperfect, and out of the tension between the two emerges something better. What does it mean it's something better? Because pre-creation, God is alone. Post-creation, we share. He's given us the gift of sharing his existence. We exist. There's us there. The problem with our existence is that we're imperfect. We contradict his infinite perfection, and that's why we live in a damaged world. And because there's a contradiction between me, who feels to some degree godless, and God's infinite perfection. But as we head and strive towards a perfected world, that contradiction will be ever more resolved, and we'll arrive at a place in which we can have the best of both worlds. We can have our existence that is in no way a contradiction to the absolute perfect existence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Taking this one step further, the Arizal, and we'll see why this is important for Rav Kook's thinking in a few moments, it speaks about this as Kalim and Shaviras Kalim. And he sees this as a process that, again, winds its way through history. So a keli is a utensil, is a container, is a vessel. And one way of thinking about creation is that it is a vessel for the outpouring of life and existence and divine energy that comes from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So we can think of again, we're using the Arizal and Rav Kook are using language and metaphor to explain ideas that are very difficult to understand. But they have this image of this pouring of divine energy into our existence, which they use the metaphor of it being a keli, of it being a utensil to receive it. The difference, of course, between the coffee being poured into my cup and divine energy being poured into the keli is that the cup exists and the coffee is poured into it. In the case of creation, the very existence of the keli, of the utensil, is itself part of that which is poured in. But this is the image they use, and they see that in at the heart of creation lies a tragedy, you can call it, or a destructiveness, because the divine energy wants to overwhelm the keli. It's too powerful. It's too big. It's like pouring into a glass cup, burning hot water or liquid, hot liquid. It shatters the utensil, and this is the source of this imperfect world within which we live. We're living in a shattered world because we can't cope with the divine energy, and that's in a sense again this thesis and antithesis, perfection versus brokenness, and the synthesis that emerges from this, which is what we call redemption or teshuvah or geula, is the refixing of this broken relationship. I just want to not leave this completely in the abstract. So I just want to try and psychologize this or put this in relatable terms so it doesn't remain abstract. I want to emphasize that when I'm doing this, I'm not doing what Rav Kook does or what that Arizal does. They don't explain these metaphors in modern language in the way that I'm doing, because these metaphors mean so many different things and are so much bigger than any one of these explanations. But I don't want to leave this completely ungraspable either. So I just want to explain what this means. One way of thinking about this is in human relationships. So the analogy to our relationship to HaKadosh Baruch Hu is like a child emerging into adulthood. So a child is formed and created and molded and developed by their parents and by the education that they give. But a parent is only successful if they develop in the child self-confidence to recognize there's a me here, there's an I here, I'm my own independent person. But in the process of discovering that independence, the child can feel squashed by the parents who have everything, whilst they have nothing. The parents are in control, they're powerful, they've got the financial resources to sustain the child, they've got far more life experience and intellectual wisdom and emotional intelligence than the child can have, because they're many decades further on in life. And for the child, there almost needs to be an act of exploring boundaries or rebellion in order to work out what's their own place, what's their own space, where do they exist. So you have here, if you like, a thesis and an antithesis. You have the home and the closeness of home and the lovingness of the parents who are just so desperately want to give everything to their child, but in the process of so doing, they have to create a rebel in some shape or form. And again, rather like God, they've created it's not just an empty vessel they're filling, they're creating the very vessel itself by doing it. When a parent is building a child, they're not just pouring goodness into the child, but they're building up the utensil itself. And you end up then with this antithesis, with this rebellion that takes place. The outcome, of course, is a synthesis in which now the parent and child have a relationship which was and is as harmonious as it was when the child was very little, and yet also has the independence of an adult child, and the two are able to work together. So something like that is how the Arizal is seeing creation. You have this God who's created us. The very essence of the gift of creation has to be that we are independent. Otherwise, there's no point in us. If we're just automated, we're just robots, then what are we? We're just another chair, another table that's God created. So we have to have independence. And the very gift that God is giving us is independence. But the paradox of the gift of giving independence is that you can't give it. It has to be self-discovered. It has to be self-achieved. You can create the conditions to achieve that independence, but you can't give someone independence. And they have to find it themselves. And in the process of finding themselves, they have to go through a stage of rupture from God. And this is almost seeing in Aveira and in sin almost an inevitability in it, because it's only through exploring the boundaries and getting to the edge that you can then come back in and rebuild the relationship. Now, you can see the danger of the idea. We've mentioned many, many times that within Kabbala, there's a risk of it becoming what we call antinomian philosophy, or against halacha, or somehow justifying hate, justifying sin. We've mentioned it from other angles, but this is another way of thinking about it. That in a way, sinning is flexing muscles and exploring sinning is the 2-year-old toddler throwing a tantrum, which we think is also from the 2-year-old discovering themselves and their identity. And sinning is the teenager also throwing a tantrum in a way and saying, I'm not going to do this just because my parents told me to do this. Just because of that, I'm not going to I'm not going to do it, because otherwise I'm not me. Who am I? I have to rebel in order to be myself. Now, this isn't a justification of singing ultimately, because at least in theory, you can push things just to the boundary without going over the edge and create space for each other. But this is the idea of Shavira and Tikkun being built into the process of creation is an idea that doesn't come from Rav Kook. It comes from the Arizal. The idea of being able to read history as a series of events in which this occurs, again, it originates in the Ramchal, but I don't know of any thinker that develops these ideas as far as Rav Kook does, and so openly celebrates this process and builds it into his philosophy. And I just before I take this, I just want to give one example of how Rav Kook does this, and to what extreme degree he does this, and to understand why he upsets people in his surroundings. Because Rav Kook, again, is not just a Kabbalistic thinker and a mystic, he's also in a certain special way a modern Orthodox thinker. He's thinking about how Orthodoxy and modernity go together, and he sees history as this series of dialectics, as we've just explained. And one application of it is in the rise of atheism and Zionism. And don't forget that to a significant degree, when Rav Kook is dealing with it, there's a link between the two. The same figures who are the early founders of nationalistic secular Zionism are profoundly secular. They're very anti-religious. They're going to sweep away all the old and create a new. And we're living in a world in which we're sort of, again, love of Eretz Israel was always a Jewish value. But the idea that Jews should take history by the hands and go and build a state of their own is not an obvious idea. And many are very nervous about this idea. And Rav Kook is one of the great thinkers who embraces it. And he says this famous line, the old will become the new and the new will become holy. And what he means by that is that he says atheism may look like it's antagonistic to traditional life, but it presents an opportunity for the refinement and improvement of Yiddishkeit, because atheism's denial of HaKadosh Baruch Hu sweeps away all the antiquated, superstitious theological beliefs and allows a more pure form of Avodas Hashem to emerge. Zionism may outwardly seem like it could be a secular replacement of Jewish religious identity, but it forces us to get to the heart of what we are as a people, and therefore out of that something more and positive and exciting will emerge. So again, just to put this in more normal, relatable terms, but Rav Kook means much more than this. If someone challenges you about your emunah, and you go through a wobble and a questioning and so on, out of that emerges hopefully something stronger and more profound, in which you have all the same depth of emunah as you once had, but with a deeper insight and understanding. If someone pushes you out of your comfort zone, they do these experiments or challenges with kids. Imagine all you could take with you was 20 kilo that you can take on your aeroplane flight down, so all your possessions. Forces you to grind down. What am I really about? What's at the heart of what really matters to me? So golus and exile and expulsion and so on forces us as Jews to think what's the baggage that we really need to carry with us? What are we really about? And therefore, when the religious world is exiled, in a sense, into the secular world and forced to confront it, out of that emerges something truer and better and richer. So again, Rav Kook is not chas v'shalom embracing any atheism or secularism, but he's saying we don't need to see it as an enemy. It's not the enemy of true religion. It's the enemy of primitive religion. Who is threatened by the arguments of the atheists? Whose religion wobbles when they encounter those arguments? Only those, says Rav Kook, who have a pseudo relationship to the Yiddishkeit. It's not deep enough inside them. They're not living Hashem. They're not living with HaKadosh Baruch Hu in their lives. They're not seeing Him in everything. Their religion has become superficialized has become primitive. If there's a real Yiddishkeit there, then the Yiddishkeit that will emerge from this will be something much purer and much holier and much stronger. So this is just an example of how radically Rav Kook was willing to say this. Leonard.
On the idea of the Arizal, and following on to what you just said, there are a lot of commentators that say, the Mauritian tried to push those boundaries as well when he knowingly and he came unstuck. But I mean, it's the same idea when you go down that route.
Yeah, so I don't want to go too far down this path because it's his own topic, but 100% yes. They apply this to hate. So, one way of thinking about Adam Rishon in Gan Eden is like a human in infancy who has to rebel, and Adam sees that the only way he can survive is by ignoring HaKadosh Baruch Hu's command. If I listen to what Hashem tells me, then what am I? I'll never be myself, and I have to rebel just for the preservation of my own sanity, my own ability to function. If I surrender to Dad, who's always bossing me around and telling me what to do, there'll be nothing of me left. It'll in my survival. I had a very visceral example of this in teaching, and I think all teachers, by the way, recognize this. All parents recognize this. I had a student who, the background, wherever the exact background was, the child was desperate to go and serve in the army. We're talking about 15 years back, so not long before the current conflict. But their life dream was to serve in the army, and they spoke very, very strongly about this. And I didn't know the student well enough to understand the psychology at work in this particular individual's case. That's always what he said. One day he came to school and said that he's not going to the army. He was looking really down and glum about it. And I asked him why not. And the story that emerged was that his father, with whom he had a very difficult relationship, was fiercely opposed to him going to the army. And his father had always been opposed to him going to the army, and this kid was determined to go to the army. A few days before, his father had finally come round to the idea of him going to the army and had begun calling up all his friends. His father was a very, very capable person, an enormously charismatic, talented, successful individual. And the father had begun calling up all his mates in Israel to try and begin getting space for his son to get into the army, and which unit he's going to get into, and where he'll go. And suddenly the son was feeling controlled again. And the only way the son could deal with this was by saying, I'm not going to go to the army. And he was down about this because his dream was gone. But really, it turns out that what was going on was his desire to go to the army was simply an escape. And as soon as his father buys into it, which was what he's been longing for all this time, suddenly it ceases to be that escape. And now he can't go to the army. And through a series of conversations, she leads him to the realization that actually he's still defining himself by his father. He's just defining himself in opposition to his father because he's just going to do the opposite of what his father wants now, is being just as controlled. And what he needs to discover is what he really wants. Who is he really? And when he's able to do that, he'll actually be able to develop, which thank God he has, a good relationship with his father again, because he's got his own space to so do. So this is one way of understanding Adam Rishon. It doesn't justify, but it makes us understand what's going on. Rav Dessler, who's a very, very interesting thinker, who I think right at the beginning of the Sunday morning series we looked at in depth, he speaks about this in terms of Yishmael and Avram's relationship, in terms of Esav and Yitzchak's relationship. And he points out that each of the first two others had two children, one of whom followed their path and one of whom didn't follow their path. And in a series of interesting essays, he argues that the child who veered off their father's path was the one who was naturally more similar to their father. So, for example, if we think about Avram and Yitzchak, they're very different figures. Avram is this massive extrovert that astride the world stage, bringing people in, doing chesed, inviting guests, mixing with kings and politicians and so on. Yitzchak is a much more austere character. He's driven by very different things. He's a severe character. He's an introvert. We don't see him reacting to everyone. So Yitzchak forges his own path. Yishmael, he argues, who we get this figure of, this para-Adam, this larger-than-life character, he argues is naturally more similar to Avram, but doesn't therefore manage to deal with the challenge of, can you imagine what it's like being a son of Avram? Can't be easy, right? So again, this is, God forbid, no criticism of Avram and no justification of a Yishmael. This is, God forbid, no criticism of a Yitzchak, nor justification of an Esav. And again, he argues in this essay that Yaakov forges his own path. Yaakov's Ishtam Yoshe Beholim. Esav he argues, is naturally by nature more similar to Yitzchak. He has a certain sternness and severity to Esav. He's there's a toughness about him. And again, Esav doesn't deal with forging his own path. Again, there's always danger with over-psychologizing great individuals, but this is an essay of Rav Dessler in which he explores similar ideas of needing to forge paths and on. So this is an idea that clearly is an important idea. Rav Kook simply takes this in a a radical way in which he builds this into the very fabric of creation and uses that to embrace secular Zionism and say, don't panic. It's a phase, it's a dialectic, it's an antithesis, but out of that is going to emerge a synthesis. We've had years of powerful yearning for HaKadosh Baruch Hu and deep spirituality. Now there's a group of youth who are new, they're breaking away, they're breaking everything of the past, but that's nothing frightening, because out of that will emerge something which is greater than that which originally was. Yeah, sorry.
So it's essential to be relaxed about it. We should feel comfortable with that faith during which disruption and deviation because eventually settles down. We have to worry about individuals. They also have to worry about the whole period of time where there may be confusion, because he's saying that in the long run, something beautiful will arise.
He has a belief in history. He has a belief in the divine hand behind history. He thinks we can read history in a near prophetic way, and therefore, in a sense, he's calmer about these developments. Yeah, absolutely. I want to emphasize again, just because this can't be emphasized enough. Rav Kook is a senior posek. Also on the side, he's a complete believer in halacha. He's not using this to justify chas v'shalom breach of halacha in any way at all. He's simply saying that when it occurs and you meet this Zionist youth around his bonfire in the marshes, draining the lands and so on, give him a hug. Recognize that he's a fellow traveler. Recognize there's a spiritual call to what he's doing, and that he's playing out the sort of spiritual drama of history, and we can be okay with that. It's not, again, that what makes Rav Kook so fascinating is he's also a classic Godel. He's writing teshuvos and important halachic works, and he's a master at classic halachic reasoning and so on. But he's also willing to say these ideas. I'm going to whiz through the next dialectic he identifies. Partly because we're slightly short of time, partly because I personally find it a little less interesting, and because I understand it a little less. He speaks about the divide between body and soul, and he ties this into secular redemption and religious redemption, and that's what allows him to see the return of Jews to Israel, to Zion at the time, to Palestine at the time, and the dream of the revival of the state. Don't forget, he dies before the foundation of the state, tragically, but he sees the secular redemption of the Jewish people as another dialectic with the religious redemption of the Jewish people. He says one is Mashiach ben Yosef, the other is Mashiach ben David. Again, the mystical sources. I think we did here in the series, we looked at the era of Mashiach and Tchias HaMesim and the world to come and so on once. And I think there I touched upon the idea of Mashiach ben Yosef and Mashiach ben David, but he takes that idea to be the physical or national redemption of the Jewish people, and he says Mashiach ben Yosef, which is the secular Zionists, redeem the body, and Mashiach ben David, the ultimate Mashiach that we strive for, will redeem the soul. And we first need we need the resolution of the two in order for Jews to reach perfection. If we see the physical and the spiritual as somehow contradicting, then we can't achieve perfection. We first need the physical to be redeemed, and then the spiritual can follow. And again, it's clear that the opening up of Israeli statehood and the secular flourishing of the land of Israel has opened up spiritual conversations that previously would have been unimaginable. And I don't just mean on a technical level that we now have a country where we can be safe. And again, I want to emphasize, Rav Kook's almost uninterested in that. That's of course he wants Jews to be safe. But if that's all Zionism is about, if it just happens to be a practical solution to Jewish safety and to the problem of anti-Semitism, then that's an economic, socio-political theory. That's not the world that Rav Kook lives in. I'm not being dismissive of it, and always Rav Kook, but that's not what he's interested in. He's living in a world of ideas and Torah ideas and spiritual ideas. He's interested in the spiritual flowering of the Jewish people. If all we mean by the spiritual flowering of the Jewish people with the state of Israel is that we now have an opportunity to have, which we do have, more Talmud Torah learned than ever before, more from people living there than ever before. Again, that's all fantastic, but that's not what at the heart of what interests Rav Kook is the idea that Judaism can be again expressed in a national identity, that we can begin applying Torah values, to national questions, that's exciting. That's the restoration of the Jewish people in these very dark times when really tough things are happening in Israel. But the idea that we once again can learn Hilchos Milchama, tragically that we have to, but the idea that there can be spirituality in how warfare should be conducted were shilas that no Jew had to ask of their Rav for 2,000 years, right? More than 2,000 years, 2,300 years. Since the Hashmonaim, Jews never had to grapple with the problems of government and the problems of diplomacy and the problems of espionage and halacha, and the problems of warfare and halacha. So there's a whole new realm and the other way around, in the positive sense, that what does national tzedakah mean when the Jewish state sends aid to famine-struck lands and to Haiti or to areas where tsunami has washed over it? What does it mean to be a Jewish state amongst the family of nations? All these sorts of questions are where he sees the body and the soul coming back together again. A third dialectic he looks at is, and this is very important, is between the intellectual and spiritual sides of the human. I think I've mentioned before the sort of the fear he has of the Mulamodim, the over-intellectual elite, and the idea that they can lose something. So this somewhat aligns to that conversation. He's not anti-intellect. He's a senior posek. He's a London. He's a classic halachist also. But he says that the analytical capacity of the intellect only can present a partial understanding of life. And spiritual perception, which he links to the imagination, gives you a much more holistic view. Spirituality alone has the possibility of being unbounded. It can go wild. It can just fly off into who knows what imagined spheres. If you only use your intellect, you lose the poetic, spiritual imagination. If you only use your imagination, you don't bound it by intellect, then it can go into who knows what fantasy worlds. But the two working in partnership can give you a synthesis that's bigger than either of them. Again, I've mentioned several times the dangers of antinomianism, Shabtai Tzvi, or maybe even before that, the founders of Christianity, the rejection of the law, because these people are perhaps driven by such a profound powerful spiritual longing and vision, but that washes away all boundaries, and then you end up in chaos, and you end up in breakdown of halach, and you end up in breakdown of moral structure and any intellectual structure. So there's a danger in that, and Rav Kook speaks explicitly about this. But equally, if you just have the intellect, then you end up as cold and reasoning, but you're missing the heart, the neshama, the imagination, the engagement with it. Rav Kook ties this into other tensions in other divides in Jewish history. Hasidim and Misnagdim, the split between them is somewhat connected with this divide, and he sees this as an important dialectic, an important divide. He uses this also to engage in a criticism of modernity, and he's very sensitive to this. And he says that modernity has become so focused because perhaps actually now this criticism is wearing off, but certainly in his time, modernity had become very rationalist. It had seen the incredible power of science and intellectual reasoning, and he says you're losing the power of irrationality, on which spirituality often draws. If you think that everything is graspable by the human mind, everything can be summarized by an equation drawn on a blackboard, everything is an algorithm, then you lose what human life is about. If you think that relationships are just driven by formulae, if you think that the understanding of the creativity of the human mind they call this not minimalism, reductionism, where you think everything can just, if we understood perfectly the laws of chemistry that control how the cells in our body operate, then we can know everything about psychology, everything about emotion, everything about poetry, everything about the human being. This sort of philosophy, he's very wary of, and he's sort of excited by the rebuilding of actually looking for my notes, there's something I wanted to add to this. He says that if you go too far in all of this, then here we are. So if you go too far in all, if you go too far in either extreme, you lose something, you lose the synthesis that can occur. He ties this into the balance between halacha and nevuah. And again, I think we've referenced some of this, but he says in the era of the first Beis HaMikdash, nevuah abounded. In the second Beis HaMikdash, nevuah was lost, prophecy was lost. and it was the development of halacha, which was the rise of Mishnah and Gemara and Torah Sheba'al Peh. However, if we go too far down that path and all we learn is halacha, we lose sight of seeing HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And he says that we can see God nowadays in a near prophetic sense by seeing how he's revealed through history. So back in the day, Hashem was revealed through prophets and through miracles. If you think a lot about what Nach is, what Nevi'im is, it's about reading history. The Navi says, this kingdom that's coming to attack us is a result of this spiritual malaise, this thing going on. A lot of Nevuah, one way of defining Nevuah is Nevi'im reading history. So Rav Kook says, okay, we can still read history to some degree, and let's do that. We can discover some greater truth. Again, I want to emphasize how many, can we read history? Is that a way of knowing what to do? How classically did we work out what Hashem wants from us? We look at Shulchan Aruch. We see what Halacha tells us. Rav Kook says, no, I can perceive the stirrings of history, and there's the sparks of Nevuah are returning to Klal Yisrael, and if we can read history, we can work out what to do. By the way, this again feeds back to his embrace of Zionism. A lot of times you'll hear speakers who are supporters of religious Zionism saying we need to see where history is taking us, right? What history is telling us. Is this something that someone has said in the year 1600? Is this something that someone has said in the year 1200? And if you do read history, then what's it telling you about Jewish people? Maybe in fact, our enemies said they were reading history when they said that Judaism's in irreversible decline and that we're finished, right? That look what history is telling us. But Rav Kook is saying he can read history, and if you open a Shulchan Aruch and just look at it like that, it's very hard to see where in the Shulchan Aruch is their line about marching off to found a state in Israel and so on. But Rav Kook is saying, see what's going on and see history. And it's very hard, again, in 2024 to avoid that sort of thinking. Look at the flourishing of Eretz Israel, Baruch Hashem, in the state of Israel. Look at the miracles of 67 and 73 and the survival of the Jewish people. So Rav Kook's intellectual heirs do buy into this and do try and read history. But again, Rav Kook is seeing this as a divide between the dialectic of intellect and the dialectic of imagination, of Nevuah, of looking bigger picture, rather than what he's afraid of, which is the narrow breakdown of nitty-gritty. Yes. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. His opponents struggled even to read his works because his halachic works are written like classic halachists with reasoning and argument. His hashkafic works, they're very hard to read. They're hard to read because they're written in this poetry and metaphor, and they're like a flow of consciousness, as I said at the beginning of the series. He's not reasoning in a standard way. This, by the way, reminds us of some of the dangers of this type of thinking, because it's very hard to grab onto something and actually argue with it and deal with it, and it's like an intuition of sorts. If someone has an intuition is very powerful. We're just now this week, Professor Kahneman passed away. He was a Nobel Prize winning academic who applied insights of psychology into economics in a very special way. He was the nephew of the Ponovitch Rav, the famous Kahneman family, and he has a book called Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, a very famous book in which he talks about we need thinking fast, we need intuition, because if you had to work everything out step by step, you couldn't function. It would be too slow operating. You can't. But the thinking fast, thinking slow is much more than this. But one aspect of it is, but if you rely on intuition, it's also flawed sometimes. It's too intuitive, too quick. And if you can't, the power of reasoning is you can take someone through logical step by logical step by logical step and get them to a conclusion. Rav Kook's opponents accuse him of being too intuitive, of being prophetic, and say that this is very dangerous, and they're afraid that he's using sort of prophetic. Again, I mean, to this day, there are schools of followers of Rav Kook who are accused of being messianic, maybe with some justice, right? And messianism can be a very dangerous, uncontrollable force also. So yeah, 100% his opponents are bothered by this. I won't probe it. I'll mention one example of where I think yeah, I mean, dangerous ideas can come out. I want to emphasize, by the way, there is something very contemporary about Rav Kook, and I'm saying this in somewhat in response to what you just said. There is an ongoing discomfort with modernity that I think many of us intuit and feel. I don't now mean actually in a way it's got less, but if we think back to the 80s when I think many people felt the world had become very harsh, very scientific, very 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 lacking imagination, lacking vision, lacking spirituality, and so on. And in some ways, the rise of wokeism and so on is a reaction to that. But there's a sense that there's a loss of the romantic, the loss of the natural, the loss of traditionalism. And when you read, and forgive me for this, when you read fascism, and when you read even Putin, by the way, represents a school of philosophy. If anyone's interested in this, I mean, you can Google someone called Alexander Dugin. I don't know if any of you have heard of him. He's arguably one of Putin's mentors, and he calls himself a traditionalist. There's a whole movement that sounds like we ought to be pals of theirs, right? There's a new philosophy of tradition. A lot of it is around this idea that we need to get back, that modernity's gone wrong, it's become too cold and clinical and too analytical, and we need to get back to the nationalist soul and the spirit. And Nazism led groups of people back to the forests where we need to become one with nature again and rediscover our neo-pagan roots. And this tension there between the cut-off cosmopolitan who's broken their rooting in nature and their earthiness is a very real force. And one of the dangers of I'm not saying linking any of this to our Cook's thoughts, but one of the dangers of these ideas is they can go too far and it can be taken in a direction like that. And again, there are aspects of certain followers of Rav Kook that definitely to the external observer appear to tread dangerously close to a nationalism that's gone awry, that's gone very, very extreme. And again, everyone will have their own views around this, but there are parts of that world that seem to have gone very, very over the line, and that's a danger that is inherent in that sort of messianic philosophy, which the opponents of Rav Kook feel are inherent in some of the ideas he's just. Let me just try and use the time available just to finish up a couple more examples of his thoughts, and then I'll finish. Another dialectic, I'm just going to again whiz through this very briefly because we're short of time, is the dialectic between the individual and the nation. Again, Rav Kook is a believer in the refounding of nationalism. Judaism had become very good at understanding how the individual develops. Think how many halachas we have around individual achievements. Sifri Musa about how to be better people. Of course, part of Musa and ethical development is how do we get on with those around us. But we don't have many national works for obvious reasons. We have 2,000 years without being a nation. But there is a real dialectic here, a real conundrum. To what degree are you an individual? To what degree are you a building block for a greater whole? To what degree is the individual identity subsumed and submerged in the greater nationalistic whole? Is there no such thing as society? As if you promote just the individual, or is there just society and the nation, or the class to which you belong, and the individual is just a building block within that, right? Fascism and communism, and which perhaps the individual is becomes less. To what degree is liberalism about just the individual flourishing and we can do anything, or to what degree do we need to work as a whole? Rav Kook argues that a person can't be whole, a person can't be complete, a person can't flourish unless they have a national consciousness. National consciousness means they're aware that part of their self, part of their selfness, part of their expression of self, part of their state of being, part of their way of being is as part of a national whole. And he says there's an intense yearning for that. And if you don't fulfill that yearning, people will either be amputees, they'll be missing a part of themselves if they don't have a national consciousness, or they will find their yearning to be part of a collective in a foolish and trivial way. That again, forgive me for this example, but when you go to a football match and you're part of a cheering group of 50,000 people, there is something transcendent about that. You feel part of a greater whole because you're all working in unison together. There's a beauty to it. There's an aesthetic to it. There's a transcendence to it. But Rav Kook says what we're doing is we're taking that which is transcendent within ourselves, that yearns to be part of a greater whole, and we're feeding it junk food just to shut it up, just to keep it quiet. We really should be using that yearning to be part of a greater whole, to be part of a people. And he says that second way this can go wrong is if we choose nationalism because we yearn to be part of a whole, but then it takes the dark underbelly of nationalism and it becomes fascism or the like. So he's conscious of nationalism, but he's conscious of the dangers of nationalism. But he basically says we have no choice. If we resist the idea that we're part of a greater whole, either we're amputees, we're just missing a part of ourselves, or we feed it with junk foods and we channel our yearning to be part of a greater whole into football teams, or no, do get that, but just that's the psychology, he says, of what's going on, or we go into a dangerous form of nationalism. But nationalism is an antithesis to individualism. The synthesis that should emerge should be one in which we find the fullest of expression of ourselves in partnership with being part of a whole. And in the case of Jewish nationhood, that will be a relationship to God, because that's where we take transcendence. So again, this is, are you with me? Does this make sense? This is tying in the ideas of all the ideas of Rav Kook. His Zionism goes together with his nationalism, which goes together with his spirituality, which goes together with his transcendence, which goes together with his belief in his ability to read history and understand it. Another synthesis antithesis, which I'll just mention very briefly, I'm not going to dwell on it, is there's the inner and outer. He sees the inner as expressed by Torah and the outer as expressed by secular studies, and he sees the two that can go together. His famous speech, remember, in the founding of the Hebrew University, in which he upsets everyone because he says, Torah, so those who are classic, understandably, completely understandably, what you're applying this posuk to secular university, this is ridiculous. Those who are classic traditional Talmid Chachamim are horrified by this, but then the university staff are horrified by this because they see this rabbi trying to tell them that you can only, run your university if you're in line with the traditional values, and he thinks that all the staff ought to be frum and etc. So again, thesis and antithesis. I want to give one. I want to give one example of how some of his successors have applied his ideas. I'm going to make no comment about the application of this idea, other than to suggest that many would feel uncomfortable with it. And because I was asked about where the modern application of some of Rav Kook's ideas have gone, and I just want to bring out the danger in these ideas, and then just try and conclude with some parting thoughts. Rav Kook died before the founding of the State of Israel, before seeing the Holocaust. He had a son and a successor, Tzvi Yehuda, he had many students. One of his students and one of his successors is Tzvi Yehuda, who is the intellectual rebbe of parts of the Gush Emunim and parts of many passionately religious Zionist Jews in Israel today. Some of whom present themselves in ways that definitely sounds very much like classic nationalism and Catholic extreme nationalism. And there's definitely an aspect of Rav Kook's thinking which can be, and his son's thinking, which can be warped into quite dark trends. Tzvi Yehuda applied the idea, the concept of thesis and antithesis, which has this tension and this destructive element to it, and then a synthesis that emerges to it, into giving insight into the events of the Holocaust and the idea that Golos had corrupted Jewish history, and that there's something cleansing about the rupture with the past that it created. Now, I'll simply say that it did create a rupture in Jewish history, and I don't think it's treif to say that when you have a rupture in history, creativity emerges from that, and rebuilding sometimes occurs with something new. And it's also not treif to say that sometimes parts of that new that emerges can be in some respects better than the past that was. However, I think one has to be very careful how far one takes these ideas and how one expresses these ideas. I'm not going to comment further other than to say, for those who are interested in this topic, have a look at the writings of some side of the followers, and there are trends there which are I think are a little alarming. There's many that speak about rupture and reconstruction. The raw concept, I understand. I think that if one begins using language around cleansing problems in Jewish history, I think one can edge into territory that certainly I think would make many of us feel a little uncomfortable. Okay, I want to just finish off by, in a way, borrowing Rav Kook's language and talking about synthesis and thesis and antithesis, and simply say that Rav Kook is a giant of a person. He's a world-class classic Talmud Chacham, a world-class posek. He confronts modernity in a truly unique way, and sees, because of his, and he's someone, by the way, who lives with HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the most profound way imaginable. He inhabits a spiritual world because of that transcendent plane on which he lives. He's able to imagine a future, to see a future that almost no one else can. He's excited by and sees a spiritual depth in science, even in aspects of science that are problematic, the universe, evolution. He's able to see it in political philosophies, even political philosophies that are potentially problematic, like Zionism, secular Zionism, far left Zionism. He's able to see it in human beings. He loves every human he sees the spark of the divine in them. He's speaks about big picture ideas in a way that many others felt had been lost in halachic nitty-gritty. He's conscious of the dangers in that, as much as he embraces modernity, he's conscious of the dangers of modernity. He speaks about the detachment from nature and from reality that can occur. He's conscious of the dangers of his ideas being taken towards antinomianism and rejection of halakha. He's conscious of the ideas that the overemphasis on imagination and prophecy can lead to a rejection of reason, and he's aware of the dangers that can be taken too far there. He's a remarkably original thinker, able to say things and saying things that no one else dares say. And he pulls all of this off whilst on the one hand, as I tried to say, very little institutional buy-in, but captures the imagination of people to this day. We're fascinated by him, we're captivated by this. And he also pulls this off without ever breaking ranks with his colleagues. Many of his contemporaries are very profoundly disturbed by what he says. A few of them therefore reject him, but most see him as a great Torah figure who's a little different to everyone else, but still a Godel and a Gon in Klal Yisrael. He's a very, very nuanced thinker, a very complicated thinker. He writes in the language of poetry. It's not surprising that his works continue to fascinate, continue to be published. As I said, he wrote prolifically through his life, and his notebooks are still being uncovered. Even some of his followers, occasionally when they publish versions of his work, censor him because to this day, some of his ideas are so revolutionary they struggle to publish it. And then another edition will come out without the censorship there, and he's a difficult thinker. It's not surprising when you have someone so nuanced that out of them they can give birth to what I would consider in many ways the mainstream religious Zionist world, and aspects of the world which I think are troubling and have gone very far. I hope, and I want to conclude by asking Mechila from Rav Kook and his opponents, I hope that nothing I've said has been in the least disrespectful to him or to his opponents. We're dealing with an era in history in which great people were grappling with great problems, and he was a great man who grappled with great problems. And I hope I've shared a little bit about the wrongs of him, and also the complexity, and also that which is difficult and troubling within what he says. So that's my tefillah. But I'm very conscious that over this time we've spoken about very difficult and deep ideas. We're going to do a much smaller series of Our Next Great Thinker. I'm still torn as to who to do, but I'm open to nominations. But I think for now we've explored Rav Kook at a reasonable layer of depth. So we'll stop there, and I wish everyone a good day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Okay.